All right, welcome back, guys. This is it. We're going to finish the Civil War and our 1301 class. We're going to assassinate a president. Sorry it always ends that way, but yeah, that's where we end 1301, and then we'll pick up after Lincoln stuff with our 1302 class. All right, so where we last left off, the Union had just won a major turning point victory with the Battle of Gettysburg. That was July 1st through 3rd, 1863. And remember that earlier that year, in fact, going into effect on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln had given the Emancipation Proclamation. You have Black troops beginning to serve for the Union side. You'll have upwards of 200,000 serve throughout the war. This war has a new birth of freedom. It is a new motivation. It is now not only being fought to preserve our country, founded back in the spirit of 1776, but also to free the slaves. Now that has been labeled as the purpose for this war through things like the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. Now, taking place around the time that Lincoln issues that address at the commemorative National Cemetery that was founded for all the over 50,000 dead soldiers at Gettysburg, you're going to have a very important series of battles taking place in southeastern Tennessee and northwest Georgia. This is in the Appalachian Mountains. And the scenery there it's beautiful. It's the most beautiful place you could imagine. Imagine like green mountains, super high above the clouds, these roads that crisscross back and forth, these lush valleys. Like, this is a gorgeous scenery, and there's going to be just absolute carnage taking place in this beautiful, beautiful terrain. So the first battle was the Battle of Chickamauga, which I just love to say. And that was a Confederate victory for Braxton Bragg. Braxton Bragg was an old general buddy of Confederate President Jeff Davis. And Bragg makes a lot of blunders throughout the war. A lot of key defeats happened under Bragg's command. Yet, when many of the other Confederate generals urged Jefferson Davis to fire Bragg or replace him, Jefferson Davis actually goes all the way out to the Army camps and sits in the tent with Bragg and all of his other commanders and says to their faces, "You want to fire your commander here?" And I mean, that's super embarrassing. Like, the military hierarchy is super rigid, and he's asking them in front of their commander if they want to relieve him of duty. But they hate him so much. He's so ineffective and makes so many mistakes. They actually, to his face, say, "Yeah, we want you to get rid of him." And then Jefferson Davis, who came all the way out to do this, says, well, no, you're going to have to keep him. So suck it up, because they went way back. Anyway, so that was probably a big mistake on Jefferson Davis's part, keeping Bragg around. But hey, it worked out for the United States. So can we really complain? So Chickamauga is a victory for the Confederates, but they were not able to completely destroy the Union Army there in northwest Georgia. And so now the Union Army is holed up in this little town in southeast Tennessee called Chattanooga. And this will begin really 4 major battles that take place. So we call it the Chattanooga Campaign. And the battles that I really find a lot of interest in, because I had a relative that was one of the brigadier and then promoted to major generals during this battle, was the Battle of Lookout Mountain and the Battle of Missionary Ridge. And they're also really interesting because, again, the scenery is just so breathtaking. You have the Battle of Lookout Mountain, you have all these troops, going up this incline to attack the Confederate stronghold at the top. It's like this steep. Okay, imagine fighting and that kind of steep, like literally climbing up a mountain that's so tall, literally, the clouds are below you. So it's called the Battle Above the Clouds. Very dramatic scenery takes place. And also, what happens here is that you're going to have the convergence of our main Union duo. Okay, I should say trio, because you're actually going to have Hooker's forces as well. But you'll have General William Tecumseh Sherman, okay, coming from the from the west here to relieve the beleaguered Union forces. And Lincoln has just made General Grant, fresh off of his victories at taking the Mississippi Valley with the Battle of Vicksburg. Remember how critical that was, cutting the Confederacy in half, cutting off their supply lines to like Texas and stuff. Oh, and by the way, France had been helping out the Confederacy as well as Britain. Remember, Britain had been selling ships to the Confederacy. They tried to leverage their cotton. France was sending some supplies, somewhat successfully, not all the time, to the Confederacy through Mexico and then in through Texas. Remember, Texas was also the major beef supplier. More on that later in 1302 for the Confederacy. So they're cut off after the Battle of Vicksburg and Fort Huron. Fort Hudson, Fort Huron. They got the Mississippi. So Lincoln, struggling for leadership back in the East, none of his generals can really take on Robert E. Lee. Meade was able to kind of halt Lee's advance there at Gettysburg, but he didn't, again, just like McClellan, didn't follow through and cut off Lee before Lee was able to make it back down into Virginia. So Lincoln desperately wants a general that is as ambitious and offensive as the Confederate General Lee. And that is why he hears about these victories out west with Grant. And so Grant is going to be his guy. And so now Ulysses, will you stop screaming, please? Cat will not stop yelling. Sorry. And so now Ulysses S. Grant is going to be the head chief, the military chief of all federal Union forces now. And as his first big engagement now, here's this Chattanooga campaign, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, the Battle of Missionary Ridge, and these other smaller battles take place as part of it. And with his forces, Grant and Sherman and Hooker, they're able to win the day. And now that they have control of Southeast Tennessee, now this is going to be used as a staging point to move east. Okay, the gateway to the east has been thrown wide open with Chattanooga's Union victory. And now going into the east, the first engagement where we're going to see Grant actually go head to head with General Robert E. Lee, the two major Union and Confederate generals are for the first time squaring off against each other is going to be the Battle of the Wilderness, fought in Virginia. And now Grant has control of the Army of the Potomac, this major force. And unlike Meade, unlike Hooker, unlike McClellan especially, Grant has a different strategy to warfare. It's a war of attrition, which means he knows that the Union has way more people than the South has, and he's going to use that to his advantage. I'm sorry, I have to go comfort a crying cat. All right, cat has been mollified. I just want attention. Okay. All right, so Grant versus Lee, Battle of the Wilderness, Virginia, right? Yeah, Grant is going to launch a war of attrition. He's going to use his overwhelming numbers to basically win the day. It doesn't matter in Grant's perspective. I mean, he cares about his troops. He doesn't want them to die, but he's more concerned with winning the field and capturing Lee, bringing the fight to Lee. Unlike all these other generals like McClellan, who had been all cautious, Grant is going to risk his men in order to win the day because he knows he has more men than Lee does. If the Union loses, 20,000 troops, if they lose 40,000, if they lose 60,000 troops, it doesn't matter because they have more than that amount to replace them with. So he's just throwing men into this battle. Meanwhile, Lee doesn't have the troops to reinforce his losses. He can't afford to lose as many as Grant does. And so, and the Battle of Wilderness, it's fought, like you see in the thickets there, the brush, all these trees in the forest. It's a very harrowing, scary battle, a lot of obstacles, and it's very inconclusive at the end who won. But the major toll was that a lot of troops died. Grant loses nearly twice the amount that Lee does, but again, it doesn't matter. He's going to win the day. And it's for this approach, this war of attrition approach that Grant is going to take to by any means necessary, by whatever troops amounts of casualties it takes, he's going to accomplish his objective for this strategy that Grant is employing, a strategy that will become known as total war. Like, everybody's going to have to sacrifice. You do whatever it takes to win the day. Grant will get the nickname. Remember, he was unconditional surrender Grant. Now he's going to get the nickname the Butcher. Grant's the Butcher, because he's just throwing all these troops into the battle, not worried about his casualty count. So it's inconclusive. Grant would attack and then basically pull his troops back and then attack again. He doesn't retreat. He just keeps attacking at different points, throwing more and more men. Lee, meanwhile, is trying to strategically move around and retreat. So it's not conclusive who wins this Battle of the Wilderness, and it goes right into the Battle of Spotsylvania, or whatever it's called, there in Virginia, which is again inconclusive. So they're going to be doing this throughout 1864, and Grant's ultimately trying to capture Lee's force. Because again, it's just like in the American Revolution, it's just like in the Texas Revolution. It's not really about capturing Richmond, the capital. It's about capturing the Confederate Army. If you do that, you win the war. All right. General William Tecumseh Sherman. By the way, Sherman, very hard man, very, very serious guy, scary dude. His middle name, Tecumseh, is named after the famous Tecumseh of the War of 1812, that Native American leader who got really close to carving out Native American Confederation in the Great Lakes area. So Sherman, after Chattanooga, is going to be tasked with taming Georgia, basically. And so he's going to be progressing east. And he finally makes it to Atlanta, only to find that the Confederates have laid waste to Atlanta. They actually destroyed all their munitions, and much of the city was burned to the ground by the time Sherman gets there. Sherman then, from Atlanta, 60-mile march from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, which is on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, is going to do this very famous episode called Sherman's March to the Sea. And this is where he implements, like, if he wasn't already, which he kind of was, this policy called scorched earth. Okay, and to do scorched earth in warfare, again, part of total warfare, means you're going to destroy anything and everything that the enemy could possibly use to their benefit. So that means like burning it down, okay? Any towns, any cities that they came across on this 60-mile death march, basically, they're going to burn, they're going to raze. Any farms, they're going to burn, they're going to kill the livestock, they're going to slaughter the people. They are just going to tear a hole through Georgia. That's the scorched earth policy. Leave nothing behind. And so his troops, very well supplied. He keeps his supply lines very fresh. He's got, constant, resupply of weapons, of bullets, of food, and everything else. He's leaving nothing for the Confederate Army, meanwhile, who already were starving to begin with, remember? So this is the scorched earth policy of Sherman. And we will talk more about Sherman actually in Reconstruction not too long from now, the 40 Mule policy, the Special Field Order 15, and all of that. But keep in mind that he is laying waste to Georgia. That's the scorched earth policy, Sherman's March to the Sea. All right. Now, in 1864, while Sherman is laying waste scorched earth to Georgia, while Grant is battling it out inconclusively with Lee and losing lots of troops, the morale for the United States, for the Northerners, was pretty much at an all-time low. Like, this war is dragging out, and people are getting pretty tired and sick of it. There's at this point, hundreds of thousands of men that have died. And what's it all for? Many of these Northerners, slavery was not something that they were willing to die for. To end slavery was not something that they were willing to give their sons for. Some were, and I mean, huge honor and props, like respect for those that were. Like that's pretty amazing heroism and bravery for that. But many were not. And so Lincoln actually in 1864, a presidential election year, he's going to face some pretty stiff opposition. You'd think, you know, hey, it's Abraham Lincoln. It's in the middle of the Civil War. This should be no sweat. But he is going to face a Democratic challenger, a Northern Democrat who you already know about, named George C. McClellan. That's right. His former chief of the Federal Army is going to run against him. And McClellan, as a Northern Democrat, does not appreciate, you know, he's speaking to a lot of the racists up in the North. He does not appreciate the Emancipation Proclamation or the idea that the North is fighting a war to end slavery. So he's appealing to a lot of the racists throughout the North, which there were many of them. And he also is appealing to the war weariness of many Northerners who are just very tired from this fight continuing on, taking their family members, taking their loved ones, taking their lives, their food, their supplies, their everything. And so McClellan's main platform, if he were elected, was to say that he would end the war immediately. He'd call for a ceasefire so both sides would stop and begin peace negotiations and basically let the South be independent. Now, this strategy ultimately turned off most Northerners who, even though they're weary and tired of the war, they didn't want to just basically give it up, because that would be tantamount to surrender. And then all of the deaths, all the casualties that they had suffered so far would have been in vain. And so that is the main reason McClellan loses. You should also know that Lincoln, he actually faced opposition not just from McClellan as a Northern Democrat, but Lincoln also faces opposition in 1864, his reelection bid, in the nomination process for the Republican Party. Old John C. Fremont, I guess not so old, definitely better looking than Lincoln was by this point. Some people say Lincoln aged like 10 years in the course of the 3 years of the war to this point. You look at pictures of presidents and how they age. Look at like Obama. He looked so young when he got elected, and now he looks like he's ancient. I guess, 8 or 10 years will do that to a man, but the presidency is a pretty stressful job, and Lincoln had probably the most stressful presidency of any president we've ever had. Civil War was pretty darn stressful. He even lost a son in the middle of it. His older son, we'll talk about more in just a moment here, was actually served on Grant's detail. So John C. Fremont, the original Republican presidential candidate in 1856, the first senator from California, the man who helped as a captain create the Bear Republic, and running as a more abolitionist-minded radical Republican. John C. Fremont nearly captured the Republican nomination in 1864, but ultimately for national unity, and Lincoln wasn't, a strong opposition of the radicals. He was just more of a moderate. Fremont, in the effort for the war, drops out. And so Lincoln does win his reelection in 1864, but he had some challengers. All right, and the next thing we're talking about is the beginnings of what we call Reconstruction. This is started even before the Civil War was over, started by President Lincoln, obviously before his assassination. Reconstruction means trying to piece this shattered nation back together and make it whole once more. So Lincoln, in 1863, this is when, after the Battle of Vicksburg, remember the Mississippi Valley has been secured by Grant. Lincoln is trying to come up with a way to help bring these places that are now under Union control back into the fold. And instead of having to have constant military, martial law controlling these Union-occupied Confederate territories, try to get some semblance of a civilian government back in place. So again, this is the beginning of Reconstruction, what we call in the phases of Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, or wartime Reconstruction is another term for it you might hear about. So Lincoln calls for what he terms the 10% plan. This diagram is a little childish, but it basically spells it out pretty well. So for like in Louisiana or for in parts of Mississippi, including the former plantation of the Confederate president at the time while the Civil War was still raging, Jefferson Davis, in these places that the Union controls, these places here, of the Confederates, the white men, they would have to take a oath of loyalty to the United States of America, reaffirm, their loyalty as citizens of the Union. So they pledged this allegiance. They would also have to basically pledge to no longer have slavery. Okay. And once 10% of those Confederates, former Confederates, had given this pledge of loyalty to the United States of America and promised not to have slavery anymore, and then they would be given back all of their other property except for slaves. So once just 10% of the white Southern population in these areas promised this loyalty and refused to have slavery, then they would be allowed to create a new state government with a new state constitution for like the state of Louisiana. And the only major requirements in this state new government, this new constitution that these guys would be able to write, with just 10% of them declaring their loyalty, was that they must abolish slavery. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a really good deal for these Southerners who were just in open revolt to the Union, then you'd be right. This is a super, super chill, easy plan. It's super friendly, super nice and easy towards these former Confederates. But that was why Lincoln did it. He wanted to bring them quickly back into the fold and start to heal the wounds that this Civil War had caused. Now, one of the big problems with this plan that many more fervently abolitionist, more radical Republicans in Congress are going to take issue with was that nowhere in any of this 10% plan do African Americans, do newly freedmen have any say. They don't get to participate in the formation of this new state government that they would have to be a part of. They don't get to have any say in what rights the new government would give to African Americans. So that is a big glaring hole in this. But again, Lincoln, he wants to bring Southerners back into the fold. He doesn't want to antagonize or anger them any more than they already are. He wants to heal the nation. So it's a pretty lenient plan. Lenient means pretty easy. Now, we've talked a lot about how the Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves that were in the Confederate occupied territory. It did not free slaves that Lincoln actually had control to free, like those in the border states. It left a good million or so slaves still in bondage. Okay. But because of the efforts of Black troops, segregated Black troops that served the Union, over 200,000 of them, because of the re-election campaign and the staunch opposition from his own party who thought he wasn't doing enough, and because basically Lincoln is a smart politician, and he knows that once these Confederate governments come back into the fold, there's no way the Republicans would have any support for anything to give African Americans more rights. So this would be his last chance. At the end of the war, in fact, beginning in that final year, 1865, Lincoln and the radical Republicans and many of the abolitionists are going to be fighting for the 13th Amendment. We haven't had a new constitutional amendment in a long time, like since the election of 1800. They're the one that created the ticket, the 12th Amendment. The president and vice president running together. So this is a big deal. New constitutional amendment. Luckily, I mean, Southern states don't count, so you don't need them for the ratification process. You just need to get it through the Northern states. But again, Northern states, that's going to be a challenge as well. Okay, abolition is one thing when it's a wartime measure necessary to win the war and keep like the Confederacy from forming a military alliance with Britain and things like that. Like you can justify that to racists, but how do you justify just simply passing a constitutional amendment that just ends slavery, period? Okay. and think about, again, like the border states and everything else. But again, Lincoln and Congress, they know that as the war is winding down, once this war is over, it's going to be nearly impossible. It's going to be a really, really uphill struggle. They need to get this done, and they need to get it done soon. And this is the last great thing that Lincoln will be working on. It will finally ratify. I don't know why I have January 31st, 1865. I think I meant 1866. No, it's in December. Maybe that was when I think that was when it was proposed. But it'll get ratified in December of 1865. Now Lincoln is assassinated April 14th, dies April 15th, 1865. So he doesn't actually get to see the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But this will be the law that basically ends slavery. You could see the first clause there: neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except, and this will be a big point during Reconstruction, as a punishment for crime whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Clause 2, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So slavery is ended. Involuntary servitude is ended, but there are some exceptions, like famously in the Schenck case, the draft. Okay. And also, like I said, during Reconstruction, as we get into the Black Codes and the beginnings of Jim Crow laws in the South, as they begin to retake and remake the Southern way of life with segregation, you will see loopholes in the 13th Amendment, famously such as the chain gang, such as Blacks being arrested for vagrancy laws, for not finding work because there was no work that they could have. They could be arrested. And if you are arrested, you see, you are being punished for a crime, then you could basically be turned into a slave. And that does happen a lot in the South. So that is a big loophole of the 13th Amendment. But yes, slavery is ended everywhere in America officially by the 13th Amendment. That is a huge deal. And again, that ratifies at the end of the year in 1865. Lincoln, in March, just a month before his assassination, calls for reconciliation, saying, hey, I want to bring the North and South back together. But in his last speech, like a week before his death, he's calling for this abolition of slavery. He's doing everything he can, wrangling those votes to get this 13th Amendment passed. So this was, I think it's fair to say, the last thing Lincoln was working on and wanted. Alrighty, let's finish up the fighting here. Appomattox Courthouse. So on April 3rd, 1865, Union forces under Ulysses S. Grant and the Army of the Potomac are going to actually enter Richmond. The day before, Lee had to retreat and leave the Confederate capital. And you had this eerie scene of silence, of all this abandoned buildings and stuff as Lee's forces go through. And just a few days later, President Lincoln, remember, Richmond, Virginia is very close to Washington, D.C. So just a few days later, President Abraham Lincoln actually is walking his horse with just a small detachment of soldiers as his guard. Everybody was very nervous about an assassination attempt then. But Lincoln goes through the streets of Richmond, the Confederate capital, touring and seeing the Confederate capital. And as he's going through the streets, there's all of these slaves that had just been liberated. These newly freedmen. They come up to Lincoln and they prostrate themselves and they thank him profusely. Lincoln's very embarrassed and tells him to stand up and stuff. But that was the scene of the capture of Richmond. Now Lee is retreating, and he hears that the Confederate capital has fallen. The supply lines are now cut off. The railroads cut off. It's only a matter of time now. And so, and this is after bloody fighting with the Battle of the Wilderness, the Battle of Spotsylvania, the Battle of Petersburg, the Siege of Petersburg, all these battles. In fact, there was the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse took place in the morning of April 9th. But finally, Robert E. Lee, with two of his sons missing in action at this moment, probably very important on his mind, what's happened to his sons. If we end this war, maybe I can find them. Maybe they can be saved. Lee will actually agree to a surrender of his 60,000 forces, the Army of Northern Virginia, the main army, the most important army of the Confederate military. He will agree to surrender them at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia to General Ulysses S. Grant. And so that is the major ending of the fighting of the Civil War, but it's not technically over yet. Oh, and by the way, a couple of interesting points here. Both men were very cordial. Lee was always respected by everyone he met for being such a gentleman and everything. And Grant here paid Lee his dues. In fact, many of the Union officers and soldiers actually saluted or bowed their heads as the Confederate soldiers were like laying down their weapons and stuff in surrender. So there was very, I mean, obviously hard feelings are going to be the name of the game after the Civil War, but I think both sides were very ready for this war to end, and very kind of, some were very relieved to have it over. And both sides were very polite and courteous. The actual surrender documents were drafted up by, I can't remember his name, but one of Grant's attaches, one of his officers was a Seneca Native American who Grant had commissioned. Will go on to become a major general in the United States Army after the Civil War. This Native American officer for Grant was actually the one to draft up the surrender document that Lee signs. Lee gets on his beautiful white gelding traveler and will ride off into the sunset to become the president of Virginia University and all of that. Now, as far as the rest of the fighting goes, so that was April 9th that Lee surrenders to Grant. You're still going to have fighting into April going on down in Georgia. Remember that William Tecumseh Sherman and his fabled total war, scorched earth, march to the sea has gotten to Savannah. Well, now he's going to lay waste to South Carolina. South Carolina is going to get burnt up under Sherman, even more so than Georgia. Sherman just lays into them. And at this point, he's actually capturing Raleigh. He's going into North Carolina. So Sherman is he's carving a whole path there through the South. And his big objective, Grant is trying to capture Lee. Sherman is trying to capture Johnston, the Confederate general. The senior most ranking Confederate general besides Lee is General Joseph Johnston. I can't remember his name. But anyway, Johnston controls still 90,000 troops that are still in the field even after the surrender of Lee's forces at Appomattox. This is the biggest force of Confederates out there. But finally, Sherman's doggedness prevails, and knowing that Lee had already surrendered and that his days were numbered, Johnston, against the wishes of the Confederate governments, including Jefferson Davis, who was still out there on the run, Johnston will surrender his forces, luckily, his 90,000 troops to General Sherman. So that's pretty much the end of any threat. I mean, it could have gone many different ways. There were many of Lee's, generals who urged him to allow the troops to fragment and basically wage guerrilla warfare against the North. That's what you see often happen when you have these insurrections fall apart, that they continue to fight guerrilla tactics. But Lee didn't want that. He said that was just going to cause more, mayhem and misery for the South, and he did not want that. But there will still be fighting. There will be those, even after they hear of the news of Appomattox, who refuse to surrender. And the very last official battle, on land, that takes place in the Civil War actually happened in Texas on the Gulf Coast down south. And that was the Battle of Palmito Ranch, where you had 300 or so Confederate soldiers take on like 800 Union soldiers and win a victory there. This was in late May of 1865, so this was well over a month after Lee's surrender. And so technically the last battle of the Civil War was won by the Confederacy in Texas, and then they eventually surrender. And then there's still skirmishes that take place in some of the hills and whatnot. There'll be very famously major insurrection done by white supremacist groups, the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, by former Confederate officer Nathan Bedford Forrest in Tennessee. We'll be talking about next semester. But this is basically the end of the fighting of the Civil War. It's over. And then the very last thing, don't want to do it, but we got to talk about it. It's important. The death of President Abraham Lincoln, who led us through the Civil War, who preserved the Union, who freed the slaves. First Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, his famous assassination. Like I said, just within a week before his assassination, before his murder, Lincoln gave his last speech to the public. This was just days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. Oh, and by the way, I didn't mention it. This was also a good trivia thing. Wilmer, what's his name? Wilmer McLean. Wilmer McLean. This is in Ken Burns' famous Civil War documentary. Wilmer McLean was this farmer. He raised like sugarcane and stuff in the South and in Virginia and in Maryland. And he had a farm right there at Manassas. And so his farm was like where part of his farm was where the first Battle of Bull Run took place. And then he and his family moved because, you know, all that death and carnage, the picnickers, baskets flying and everything else. And they moved to this little farm near Appomattox Courthouse. And it was actually his house there that Lee and Grant surrender in, to sign the surrender documents and stuff for Lee. And so Wilmer McLean says that the Civil War began in his backyard and it ended in his front parlor. So that was kind of interesting. Okay, but back to this. I just don't want to talk about it, right? I don't want to kill Lincoln. So yeah, in this speech he gave right before his assassination, Lincoln actually for the first time called for Black suffrage. So not just because he's already come out in support of the 13th Amendment, he's doing everything he can to whip votes, which is what you call it when you cajole and bribe and talk to and urge and support congressmen into voting a way you want. He was already, you know, working tirelessly for the passage of the 13th Amendment to end slavery. Now, right before his death, Lincoln is progressing even further, becoming more of like instead of a moderate, more of a radical Republican. He's actually calling for the first time for Black suffrage, for Black freedmen and women to be, well, I don't know about women. I don't know if he went that far, but for Black men to be able to vote. And so that does show a progression and liberal ideological change and progress taking place in Lincoln's views on African Americans throughout the war, at least in his rhetoric. Who knows what was in his heart? But all of that gets cut short, and there's lots of like what ifs and stuff. You know, what if Lincoln had survived? What if he'd been able to not only lead us through the Civil War, but also to start the process of healing the nation and bringing us back together? His 10% plan, like we talked about, was very lenient. It was very forgiving on the South. It was meant to bring them quickly back into the fold. But he does not get a chance to really implement Reconstruction because he dies. He is shot at Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, who was a very noted, a very famous Shakespearean actor. John Wilkes Booth was known far and wide as one of the most famous actors in America. And I think it was actually Wilkes' older brother who had saved Lincoln's son from a near-death experience at a train station just a year or two before this. Yeah, Edwin Booth, John Wilkes Booth's older brother, was also a very famous Shakespearean actor as well, who'd actually played the role of Hamlet more than any other actor in the day. But the brothers were super different. Edwin was a staunch Unionist and Lincoln supporter and saved Robert Todd Lincoln's life, whereas John Wilkes Booth was a rabid, Southern secessionist and supporter of the Confederacy and hater of African Americans. Robert Todd Lincoln, by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but Robert Todd Lincoln, very cute. You should look up pictures of him. He was 17. This is Lincoln's only child of his three that survives into adulthood. And Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham's wife, remember she was this very important politically connected, Kentucky belle. She suffered huge depression while during their time in the White House from the loss of her other children, and fervently guarded and protected her eldest son, Robert, and refused, much to his embarrassment, to allow him to serve in the Union military for fear of losing him. And so finally, after much pleading and being in college for most of the war, Robert Todd Lincoln was commissioned as a captain and allowed to go into the military to serve as a attaché for General Grant, and was actually there to witness Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Robert Todd Lincoln, now a young man in his early 20s, goes and visits his father in Washington, D.C. Just literally the day before the assassination. He spent, telling his father all the stuff that he'd seen while he was at war, and decided not to attend the play that Abraham Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, attend that night. Also supposed to be in attendance was General Grant and his wife, Julia. But famously, Julia Grant and Mary Todd Lincoln did not get along, so Julia convinced Ulysses not to attend the play. They begged off and said, sorry, we don't really want to attend. But in the assassination conspiracy plot to kill Lincoln, there were actually more targets involved, and it was more, a conspiracy involves multiple people, right? It was more than just John Wilkes Booth that was involved. He had a whole ring of conspirators, these Southern ideologues. They wanted to overthrow the whole Lincoln administration, including General Grant. And so part of their plans were thwarted when Julia Grant said, I don't want to attend because Mary Todd's going to be there. So that kind of threw off their plans. John Wilkes Booth was actually the only assassin in the conspiracy that accomplished his goal. And he, as an actor, he knew Ford's Theater there in DC very, very well. He's very familiar with it. He sneaks in the back door. Nobody thought that much of it because, I mean, he was a common sight in the theater. And so he is going to basically sneak into the balcony where Lincoln is at with one of a Union captain and his wife that they were enjoying the theater production with. Lincoln is sitting right next to his wife, Mary, and John Wilkes Booth shoots Lincoln through the back of the head with a Behringer rifle, or sorry, not a rifle, a Behringer pistol, I think it's called, or Derringer, I can't remember. It's a pistol. And he shoots him through the back of the head, and Lincoln doesn't die immediately, but I mean, he was shot through the back of the head. He's going to be, that's it for him. And then Wilkes, actually the captain, the Union captain, he hears the shots and he sees, the president slump forward. And so the captain actually struggles with Booth, who had taken out a blade and was trying to attempt to stab the captain, who does get sliced really bad, loses a lot of blood. And to escape the Union officer there, John Wilkes Booth jumps down from the balcony onto the stage. And the whole crowd could hear this split as his leg breaks. Nasty, nasty fractures. He fell onto the stage, and he holds the blade up with the captain's blood on it and yells, "Sic Semper Tyrannis, the South shall rise again," all that. And then he limps off, and he's going to hide out from federal authorities for a 12-day manhunt until they finally corner him at a barn, and he is not taken alive. They kill him as they're trying to apprehend him. Now, the rest of the conspirators in the Lincoln assassination plot some of them will be caught. Famously, they also tried to assassinate the Secretary of State, William H. Seward. Seward was a fervent abolitionist, had been a contender for the 1860 Republican nomination. It's part of Lincoln's team of rivals, and Seward will be the one to purchase us Alaska. He's the reason we got Alaska. It was called Seward's Icebox at first. And so Seward was part of the plot. He was one of the intended targets, from these Booth conspirators. And two of them, they snuck into his home where he was convalescing. He had actually, I think, fallen off of a horse or something just prior to when all this went down, and had a nasty, nasty neck injury. Actually had like a whole big metal apparatus keeping his head in place because of his neck injury. And so when the assassin went to stab Seward, and there was a bodyguard there that actually had been overcome and everything by one of the two assassins. The other assassin sneaks up while the bodyguard is tussling with this guy. The guy goes to stab Seward in the neck, and he ends up hitting this middle, bracer, basically, which saves Seward's life. Now he's very sick and he's not doing too well. Seward already, he was in bed when he was attacked, but he manages to basically hold off the assassin long enough for the guards to get there. And so he's been stabbed and he's bleeding, but he ends up surviving. William H. Seward. The other person intended, so it was supposed to be Grant, Seward, Lincoln, and then the last person was the vice president, Andrew Johnson, who we will talk a lot about in 1302. Andrew Johnson was the first of our three presidents that was impeached. And Johnson was a Democrat, but he was a Unionist Democrat. He had been the military governor, basically, of Union-controlled Confederate territory of Tennessee. But Andrew Johnson, the vice president, was the other intended target of the conspirators. And the assassin that was supposed to go into the hotel and shoot Vice President Johnson ended up getting cold feet. He got too nervous, so he backed off. And so that never took place. So that's the conspiracy around the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Okay, many Southerners they're going to be very, very upset at the end of the Civil War. They felt like it should not have been over. Their way of life, they felt, was turned upside down. And there is a lot of resentment. Now, for the other conspirators that are captured, including the mother of one of them that had ran the boarding house where the conspirators met, Mary Surratt, they are all tried and convicted and sentenced to execution by hanging. And Mary Surratt's execution was actually the first time I think the federal government had executed a woman. That is the end of 1301. President Lincoln is dead at a time when fireworks were going off and the nation was celebrating the end of this bloody, nasty, nasty war, the nastiest we've ever had, because it was only Americans that died in the Civil War. At a time we were celebrating the end of this conclusion, President Lincoln is killed and the nation is thrown into unbelievable uncertainty of what lies next. And that's where we're going to end things. Thank you guys so much. I hope to see all of you back for 1302 to pick up where we left off. Remember, 1302 is going to be picking up right at the end of the Civil War. We'll be talking about reconstructing the nation, Reconstruction era. We'll talk about the Gilded Age. We'll talk about the World Wars, World War I, World War II, where we go against the Nazis and the Empire of Japan. We're going to talk about the Cold War. We're going to talk about civil rights. A lot of the 1302 classes about civil rights. And then we will get into the modern era. So thank you guys. And I will stop there. Bye.